Bienvenidos a la Biblioteca Benjamín Franklin. El día de hoy presentamos a Donika Kelly, importante referente de la literatura estadounidense, quien escribió el poemario The Renunciations y ganadora de varios premios entre los que destacan el Anisfield Wolf Book Award in Poetry y Bestiary. Agradecemos también a la red de American Spaces que se encuentran transmitiendo este evento alrededor del país y a todas las personas que nos ven a través de Facebook Live. Pueden dejar sus preguntas en los comentarios. Recuerda suscribirte a nuestro boletín de notificaciones y estar pendiente de nuestras redes sociales para enterarte de todas nuestras actividades. Comenzamos.
Hola, buenos días. Morning. Hi, how are you? Good? Excited? Awake? Yes? Okay, that's good. Okay. Well, thank you for coming. I recognize some familiar faces. For those that it's the first time that you visit the library, thank you for coming. Just remember that the library offers workshops and different activities for you and your students to practice English and to learn more about US. So we have some conversation clubs. We have some activities for you and your students to practice, just like game night, karaoke, that it's happening today at 5 o'clock, by the way. And we also have a American Film Night, where we show movies related to the topic of the month. And we discuss, after watching the movie, we have some discussions so that we just not watch the movie, but also there's discussion around that. I hope you are signed up for the bulletin, and if done, I will pass you the QR so that you get all the information of all the different activities that we have. And also, pass the word to other colleagues, to your school, that you can come and visit the library, be part of our activities. So I hope you do that. And thank you for coming this morning. Today we have Donika Kelly coming from Iowa, but also she stopped by the Cervantino. She had a couple of programs there. Yesterday we have a program with UNAM, el Museo UNAM Hoy. And today she's doing this workshop for English teachers. And at 5, if you want to come back, you will be listening to her poems and her work. Okay? Thank you, Donika, for coming. Yes, go ahead. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Good morning. I'm so excited to talk with you all about writing and creative writing in the classroom. But first, well, okay, maybe I should say something about myself. What do I even know about myself? So my name is Donika Kelly. I'm a poet. I teach creative writing at the university level. I teach undergraduates getting their bachelor's. I've taught lots of different classes at the college level. The most fun, I think, are introductory classes, sort of bringing students, introducing students to ideas, and then sending them away to deal with the complexities if they decide to go deeper into those ideas. I've taught composition writing. I've taught world literature classes, literature and translation. And right now I teach primarily poetry workshops. So that's what I do. And what I would like for us to start with is maybe for us to go around and people introduce themselves. I would love to know your name, the level that you teach, and something beautiful that you have seen recently. This is how I start my classes. So we go in a circle and I ask them a question. Sometimes I ask them a word that they like the sound of, or a word that they have mispronounced because they never heard anyone say it before, or something beautiful. Where are they in the birth order? Are they the oldest, the middle, the youngest? Sometimes that's very complicated. Um, so I really like to start those classes with my classes with a question because I think it gets us warmed up, and I'm not an expert on very much, if anything. And so I like to get other voices in the room. So if we could go, maybe we could kind
We
of.
can start. Yes, I'm gonna pass the microphone. I'm gonna ask you to use the microphone because we are streaming, and if you don't use the microphone, they cannot hear us out there. And the other thing I'm going to ask you, just like to try to look at the camera. Donika will be offended if you just do this.
okay.
Sorry. Yes. Okay. So if you, so we start with this lady. Okay.
So my name is Adriana. I teach teachers. So we train teachers in English and other subjects. And something beautiful that I have seen today is my parents. My parents were sleeping, both of them, in my bed. And yeah, so that was sweet.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andros, and I'm teach teachers, other teachers, and something beautiful. Mm, I don't know. Maybe in our club lecture, we the faces of our memberships. That when we read. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Yolanda Gonzalez. I teach undergraduate and postgraduate students English for academic purposes mainly at Colmex, but I am passionate about poetry, literature, and writing in general. So happy to be here.
Okay. Hello, my name is Andrea. Um, I'm currently working with middle school kids, so I'm teaching English, but I'm teaching also a bit of history. Something beautiful that I have seen recently was yesterday, the sunrise. It was beautiful, and the clouds and everything. So that's it.
Morning, everyone. I'm Rodrigo Reyes, but I prefer to be called Roy. I teach to students at university level. I teach at two universities. And something beautiful I've seen recently are a bunch of little pumpkins. So it reminds me of this season. Welcome.
Good morning. Hello. My name is Teresa, and currently I'm teaching CAE and IELTS and TOEFL courses preparation for the students who are going to be abroad or they are going to study abroad. And also I teach children that I love it. And for me, it's the most beautiful thing how children learn. No, I'm learning about them. And also I help children who suffer from uh, Down syndrome and autism, and it's incredible how they learn. So for me, my profession is my passion and my life, and I love English.
Hello guys, good morning. My name is Rocio and I teach adults, beginners. And I'm very happy to be here because I do love speaking English and everything that is related to. And something beautiful that happened to me today was that I made it on time because the traffic was, oh my goodness. Okay, so good. So I am so happy. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Dan. I teach undergraduates. Yesterday I saw my kids who are the most beautiful people in the world, so that's it.
Hello, good morning. My name is Anin. I teach from kindergarten to university students. And when I was coming here, I saw hummingbirds, and I love those birds. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Oh, my voice is so strong. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So, is there anyone in the room who does creative writing exercises with students at the level that you teach? You do some creative writing exercises. Fantastic, fantastic. So, I just wanted to, I was just curious about that. So in my experience, teaching writing of any kind is really hard because writing is really hard. It's very hard to write, and I think writing across, like writing in a second language seems like it would be even more difficult. The bit of writing that I did in college in Spanish, I was like, what are words? I know what I think, but how do I translate those thoughts into sentences that will make sense to somebody else in Spanish? And so I do understand to some degree the difficulty of sort of writing across language. But I do think writing, just period, is very, very challenging. And the reason is that we can sort of gain mastery in some places and then forget how to do other things. I don't know if y'all have had this experience, but it's like, oh, I now know how to do this, but wait, I forgot how to do this very basic thing. So we are constantly relearning or having to refresh. And I think for students that can feel really frustrating, like especially younger students, that sense that they shouldn't have to go backwards. But writing is so circular, it's so cyclical. And one of the things that I love about creative writing and about teaching poetry workshops is that we can just play, right? It doesn't, like I do in my classes, a lot of low stakes writing exercises. So most of the writing that my students do, I'm just asking them to try to engage with the books that we're reading. So I teach full-length poetry collections. The students read them, we talk about them, and then they do an exercise that responds in some way to or that is in conversation in some way with the work that we've read. And they get the points if they do it. It doesn't have to be good. The first day of class with my students, I tell them, you don't have to write a poem. You don't have to write anything. It doesn't have to be good. The bar is outside. I teach on the second floor, fourth floor. I'm like, the bar is on the ground outside. You are in the classroom. You have already cleared the bar. So I want to take away some of that anxiety about being good. Because trying to be good can get in the way of practice, can get in the way of play, right? There are a couple of other things that I want to say related to that, related to play. So when I say play, I'm thinking of play in the sense, like play in practice in the sense of like an athlete or a musician will practice, right? They're practicing for a performance. They're practicing for a game, but we're just like in the gym, right? We're in the sort of small session that's separate from the real writing that they would do. So what we're doing together really is practice. And in practice, we can focus on specific skill areas. We can sort of push into activities and work on specific skill sets in that practice. So I'm like, let's take a lot of that pressure off, and we're just going to try to get maybe one or two things done in the time that we have together. And that's been true for every writing class that I've taught. I want them to try to understand, maybe take away 2, 3 ideas, 3 practices that they can carry with them, 3 sets of tools that they can carry with them. And that's not just to take the pressure off of me, the person teaching, but it's also, it feels more realistic, right? Like to sort of lower, like to say, okay, like for my students, I might just want them to think about the line in poetry. A lot of my students come in and they're very scared to like make line breaks. They're like, I don't know what they are. So they want to just like make prose paragraphs. They don't want to differentiate anything. So one of the things that I often want them to think about is the line. Just like, what does it do? How can we layer meaning? I sometimes want them to think about controlling distance through point of view. And I want them to think about their images. Oftentimes, those are like the three things. They're like a strange set of three things, but those are the three things that I want them to carry away. And so that's what we work on the whole semester. And I don't announce it with every exercise, right? Each exercise is sort of asking them to think about these concepts, and it's built into the assignments. The other thing that I try to do, I'm not always good at this, but when we do writing exercises, I want to scaffold, right? So I want to prepare them through reading, through the readings that we do. I don't know if your students have this issue. My students don't take notes anymore. They just look at me. And I'm like, do you want to write anything down? And they're like, no, I'll remember. And they don't remember anything. But I'm like, just write it down, please. Because oftentimes what they don't realize is the concepts that we're talking about at the beginning of the semester are really setting the foundation for the skills that we'll build on. The exercises will build on those skills for the rest of the semester. When I give writing exercises, we do a lot of preparation. We gather a lot of material. So I don't ask them to write a poem. I don't say, today I want you to write a poem, write a poem. They'll just look at me. Now, when I was in college, if someone said write a poem, I would write a poem. I would be like, great, I know how to do that. But my students need some help entering into the space. And so I thought that we might look at a few resources that can help us imagine scaffolding. Does this sound okay? Yeah, we're good? Okay. So oftentimes, before we even start reading books, we'll look at individual poems. And we'll look at individual poems. We'll try to sort of parse out what's happening in the poem. So this is one way of thinking about, like, how do you get students to connect to literature in English? I think this is true across language, though. We look at the work, a poem, we read the poem together, we talk about it, and then oftentimes we will do an exercise. Sound keeps changing. It's okay. There's this great resource. It's through the Academy of American Poets. It's called, the website is poets.org. And they have a resource called Teach This Poem. It's really nice. Yes, this is perfect. This is perfect. Thank you so much, Javier. But then it went away. So one of the things that you'll notice when the image comes back on the screen is that they have outlined a series of activities. So at the top of the page is a poem, and then there is a recording of the poet reading the poem. And then at the bottom of the page, you'll see a set of activities. And I think it might be nice to kind of work through this one. You know, so this is not mine. I didn't do it. This is great. I don't have to invent the wheel, right? And so this says, ask your students to imagine something they did over the summer and have them paint a picture in their imaginations of what happened. Have them write a short paragraph describing the event, the people who were there, and the setting in as much detail as possible so someone else can see the picture, okay? So I think we should do it, okay? So what I would like for you to do, you can choose any season, but the poem is related, the poem that we'll look at is related to summer. Write I also think it's good for us to like do the activities that we are sort of asking other people to do just to see how it feels. So I would like for you to write a paragraph in which you paint a picture of a memory that happened during a specific season. Can be any season. They say summer here, but we don't have to do that. And try to include as much sensory detail as possible. Sometimes like I will just like make a list of like the sensory details if I don't want to write sentences, so that's also an option. But let's maybe take about, I don't know, like 5-7 minutes, something like that. Does that sound good? I'm gonna do it with you. And we'll take one more minute. All right. So let's come back together. And I think we should, oh, gracias. I think that we should get into groups of, okay, wait, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. I'm 10. So let's get into groups of 2. We'll pair up. I will be one of the pairs. And so perhaps we can, so you two here, you two, you and Dan, here, and then you and I. Does that sound good? So we're going to share what we wrote, and we'll just do that for about 5 minutes. And as we share, if I read mine, if my partner has trouble seeing, envisioning what I'm describing, then she can ask me to add more detail to help her see it better. Okay? And then we'll provide some, so we'll just like talk to each other. So you'll just read your paragraph, and then you'll talk about it a little bit, right? Each person reads. So we'll take about 5 minutes to do that. Yep, okay. Let's do. Yes, come here. But we won't speak into the mic, don't worry.
You're a professional, right? I'm not. Okay, fantastic. Because that's how our students are, right? Great. Okay. Should I read first? Yes. Fantastic. Try to get what I'm talking about. And then I saw you there, standing so quietly and peacefully right in front of my eyes that I couldn't say a word. I remained speechless. I remained silent before your greatness, the most beautiful sunset I ever seen. That's it.
So you're writing about seeing the sunset?
Yeah.
What were some of the colors in the sunset?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, mostly yellow, oranges, those colors about the sunset. Very light colors, like the color of the sand. But at the same time, it was like the contrast because I was lying on the beach. And then you see the people wearing swimsuits, and they were totally colorful. And this was in Mexico, so Mexican people, we like colors. So there were a lot of people, wearing hats and umbrellas. So it was a contrast.
With the sunset.
Exactly. And the ocean totally blue, dark blue, but the sky was totally blue as well, lighter, just a few clouds, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah. So everything that you just said to me paints, like this feels like suggestive, right? And like, guess what I'm talking about. But if you write, I was on the beach, there were lots of people in colorful swimsuits, right? It made a contrast. Like that helps me see it so much more clearly, right? So when we're doing like writing exercises, one of the things that we want our students to connect to or like be aware of is being specific, because that helps us connect with those feelings.
Yeah, it's like to invite the reader to go along with you, imagine exactly the same things as the writer or the author is imagining, right?
So mine, so I'm sitting in the hammock with my little dog. The air is very soft. The hammock is red and yellow and blue. The trees above me are green. The bark is brown. He is resting on my belly. He's very small. Chihuahua.
Oh,
Chihuahua.
okay.
But so quiet.
Oh, really?
A quiet Chihuahua.
Well, that is amazing.
It was amazing. And we are resting together. Right? So we really want, like when we have our students do like this kind of details to really show, right? That's true for all writing. We just like we want them to be specific. So wait, so you work with students who like young people who have Down and who are autistic?
No, 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 no. That's another girl.
Oh, okay.
That's the one who's right
Oh,
next
right,
to
right,
me.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you work with.
I teach adults,
You teach adults.
beginners
Mhm.
mostly,
Mhm.
and it's very hard for them to write in English. So what I do is every time I'm working with a specific dance, when I was in person classes, I used to play with them, let's say, write in English, and then I divided the classroom in two teams. And then I write some lines in Spanish, a little story actually, but in bullets. Yeah, it's easier for them to translate. And then, okay, every word misplaced or wrongly used, we are gonna get 1 point out. Okay, and that way it was like a competition for them, and they used to have fun, right? Nowadays, I teach online. It's a little bit more difficult because I do exactly the same, but they use translators. Our enemy, right? Exactly. Because in Spanish, the translation of the verb sometimes present tense is the same as the past tense. And guys, you're using a translator, and computers don't think, they process information, and that way you are learning the wrong way. So it's very complicated, you know?
I don't know how you get over that.
I don't know either,
Yeah.
being honest.
Yeah.
But I try an exercise that I like it very much. It's called Future Me, when I'm teaching future tense. And they have to write like between 80 and okay. Oh, thank you. Well, I was saying that it is not that I love the camera, but I do. Okay.
So we're talking about different exercises that we've done with
Exactly.
students, and
Yeah.
the challenge of AI, the computer generated translations.
Exactly. And one of the exercises that I used to do with my students was Future Me. So I asked my students to write about 50 and 100 words about how do they see themselves in the future to come. Let's talk about 10 years from now. And it's super interesting, the beautiful things they expect from themselves. It was a great exercise for writing.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. I think we're ready to come back together, so you don't have to stay up here if you don't want to stay
Okay,
up here.
all right, all right, very good. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Should I pass the microphone to someone else?
You can leave it here, and then if we're ready to share.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how was that to share your paragraph with someone else? How did that feel? I saw some thumbs up. You know how that goes with students. That means you have something to say. I think it was Dan.
Well, I do feel really well sharing what I write, so I have no issues. But obviously, with students, it's very, very different. The percentage of students who like sharing what they just wrote is so low. You know, most of them are like, no, no, I don't want anybody to read this. So, but in my case, it's good. I feel well.
So you worry that students might not want to share.
Yeah, I know
Yeah.
because I know them.
In my experience with the students that I've worked with at different populations, when it's small, that's easier than sharing with the whole group. So that's why I like this activity, because it's small. So the students, even if they're not sharing exactly what they wrote, they can talk about it, right? So even if they are not like, oh, I wrote down this exactly, they're still talking to each other, and that gets them warmed up and ready to talk in class. Whenever my students, I put them in an activity and they're like, they're so loud, the whole room is so loud. And then I ask a question and they're like, and I go, I just heard you talking, so I know you have things to say. And then they're like, it's a trap. And I was like, that's right, it's a trap. Group work is always a trap. Okay, so I did want us to just like do a part of this activity. One of the things that you'll notice is that this activity takes the students very slowly through the poem. So activity number 3 is to read the poem silently first. Just read it. And then the second time is to take notes about like what pops up, right? Words and phrases that help them envision the scene. And then one student reads the poem out loud. That's the next one. And then in that activity, you would have the listening students write down words and phrases that jump out to them that describe the scene. So we're really going slowly through the poem, right? We're not asking the students to like read the poem and then tell us like what jumps out, right? And then you listen to the audio. And then how is that different? How is that different? Ask your students to write down additional things that they hear from her reading. And then it's small group work, and then everyone comes back together. Because it's also my experience that there are a few students in a class. Sometimes if we're lucky, there are a lot of students who are very chatty. But we might have like a couple of students who talk a lot. And you just make sure you get them in a group, right? We know the strategy for that. And then what I would probably do is then have the students write a poem that imitates the poem that we've just worked through, that tries to have like that same level of detail, that same level of image, and it doesn't have to be good. This is very important. It does not have to be good. To get them in a space of playing with language, they might surprise themselves. Right? And they don't, I tell my students they don't have to share it if they don't want to. I'm a big proponent of not asking people to share because I think exactly for that reason. Sometimes there are the students who love to share, or the thing that they wrote is very good and it makes the other students feel bad that their thing isn't as good. They're just like those people who they're just gifted and annoying, you know? So I don't ask my students to share, like if we were to do the activity, but I would ask them to give it to me, and then I would just give them an A. You did it. But I'll read through, and if there are moments where they've done something really interesting or the English is good, I would be like, this is really strong, right? So I would give them feedback, but they get points just for doing the activity, right? So it's low stakes writing. That gives them the opportunity to play with language. And I like the activity that you described, imagine yourself in the future using the future tense, right? What if that were a poem and something fantastic had to happen? Something imaginative. Kids are really good at this. Kids are so good at coming up with scenarios. Adults we are trash. We are very bad at this. But if you can find some work that gives, that can demonstrate that, or show someone sort of doing something a little bit wild, that can be a guide. So I oftentimes am using the work that I'm sharing with my students as a guide. And I think this level of scaffolding is really helpful, right? And the thing that I really like about Teach This Poem is that, again, I don't have to invent the wheel. But then this gives me like a very easy lesson plan to use with other kinds of literature, right? And I think maybe the last thing I'll say about this is, where did it go? It slid from my mind. Oh, that talking about literature and analyzing it in like an essay is very different from trying to imitate it. And imitation is also, it's freeing in a way, right? Because there's already a structure and it allows the students to really get inside the work in a way that I find like really exciting. Like I think they come to understand something differently than if they were just describing it in an essay, right? So for the students, for the teachers that y'all are teaching, like having them really think about like how can we incorporate maybe a little bit of response to the work that's creative for their own students. it may be for them as well, right? Like, because I think it's important for all of us to practice this. Like, if we're teaching it, like, we ought to be practicing it a little bit. Yeah. Then I think that will also give students a different way in to thinking about literature and thinking about English if they are sort of taking control over the language in a different way. That's low stakes. Low stakes, as you know, low stakes writing is very, very important for all kinds of writing. Okay, I was wondering, could we see, wait, I want to stop. Do you have questions? There it is. I was like, I'm missing something. Do you have questions?
Thank you.
Or thoughts or ideas? Or
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Since I teach adults and I have seen what you say is something absolutely true and honest about the fact that we adults don't like to talk about ourselves. That's a fact. And for example, writing, it could be very challenging because we don't like to share our ideas. So do you have a suggestion or something that you can recommend us for us teachers to encourage our students to write about themselves? Or it's because if I say, okay, we are going to read about what is happening in, okay, global warming, guys. And then it's like, well, that's boring. I don't want to write about that. I mean, I don't feel connected with the topic. Well, then write about something that you really would like to talk about. And it's like, but I don't like to talk about myself either. So what's the point, you know? So what do you do in those specific terms of encourage your students or people just to write? Because I don't find the answer so easily.
That's a big challenge, I think, especially for people who don't identify as writers. Writers love, I think, most of us love talking about ourselves. I love talking about myself. I'll talk about myself all day. But this is where I think having an example that they can imitate comes in. So, and I think also having an activity that isn't writing like an essay. So like having the essay writing, you know, like trying to get the students to write paragraphs where they're talking about, you know, like the activity that you described, the sort of future tense, this is how I think I will be in the future. That's a little bit different from writing a poem about a memory, right? And so if you can have a mix of assignments where they're doing that very sort of straight work, right? That very like descriptive, like sentence, this will happen in the future. And then give them an opportunity for a creative assignment. I think that can be really helpful. My students are very shy too, though, actually, like when I think about it. And they want to write about things that are personal, but they're scared. And I tell them they can hide. So they can write from the perspective of another kind of animal. And I've done this. So I've written love poems from where the speaker of the poem is a Pegasus, you know, the winged horse, where the speaker of the poem is a minotaur, you know, the bull head and the man's body. It's all me. It's all me.
Very wise.
Right, but I can hide a little bit inside of that figure. So allowing your students to bring in maybe stories that they know and then write about an emotion from the perspective of that creature might let them write about themselves without writing about themselves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes. And one of the things that I was just thinking the other day was, my whole life I've been studying English. For me, it's been very difficult to speak English, and specifically listening.
It's a terrible language.
Well,
it's so hard. I mean, it's so hard, and there's so many
is.
different influences and words, word roots. It doesn't make sense.
Most part of my life, I've been struggling with listening, you know, and since I've been teaching British, I'm sorry, but I teach British, and I become fluent with my ideas and what I want to say. I don't know, it's very funny because I just start writing, and then I realize I just stopped translating when I was speaking or listening. So I believe writing is that, I don't know, maybe is that the key to, boom, stop, translate, and then you start thinking in English immediately. I don't know if I am right with this idea or not, but writing is one of the most extraordinary exercises to expand everything, our vocabulary, grammar, listening, and everything.
I was thinking just now, as you were talking about a potential activity where you have the students find some strange nouns in English, just like odd nouns, and then have them try to figure out how to use those nouns in like a story, right? Where it doesn't have to even make sense, but they're just like trying to use the language in a way that's somewhat logical, right? I think, especially for folks who are at the beginning, sort of some of that building block stuff can be, and this is true for my students when they're like writing, they want to kind of stay very vague. And I'm like, we need nouns and verbs. We need so many nouns and so many verbs to explain to the reader what's going on. Are there other questions about anything that I've said so far? I know there are some other resources that Christopher Merrill, who's in the back, who's the director of the IWP, has some really wonderful resources that he may come up and I may pull you up here, Christopher, to talk about those. But before we move on to that, do y'all have any other questions or thoughts or ideas that you want to offer to the space? Thank you.
Thank you. In my experience, what I struggle with is because I'm teaching, for example, the courses CAE or IELTS, students have to learn how to write different types of writing, essays, reports, formal letter, informal, etc. So sometimes it's very difficult. But what I do in the classroom is, like, first I introduce the topic, because some of the topics that Cambridge require are so weird and are so difficult because they are like in a scientific area, field, no? Medicine, about the universe, and students struggle with that. Even me, I'm a teacher, I struggle with that. And the kind of vocabulary that they request is also like very sophisticated, very advanced, like not very common. But what I try is like, first, of course, I investigate about the topic, I introduce the topic in like I don't know how to say, like a motivated way, and students respond. And also, at the same time, as you mentioned, like some students are really good at writing, they have a really good skill, and others don't. But what I do in the classroom is like to build confidence. Even if you are not good at writing, it's like we are in this process. Everyone in the classroom are in the process of learning. Even me, as a teacher, I'm learning. And they understand that, and they help each other. And for me, that is amazing. And I learned that from children. No, like they help each other. It's like, oh, no worries, that's okay. You can improve with that. And it's what I do also with adults, and it's working in the classroom. And I think that I have got very, very good results. And students really improve writing skill in different variations of writing.
That sounds wonderful, and it sounds like you've created a classroom where that's the expectation, that people will be helping each other. And I think there's so much that we can do from the head of the classroom to set the tone. And I love what you said about not being an expert. Like that's very much, or like, you know, like everyone's learning. That's one of the things that I really try to practice in my teaching. My lesson plans are very loose. Which I can do like in a creative writing class, right? So it's like I've assigned a book. There might be one poem that I want to talk about, and then I want to know the poems that the students want to talk about. And they might pick poems that I haven't even thought very much about at all, and we just work through it together, right? What feels interesting? How does this relate back to the larger question that we've been discussing? And then what techniques, I ask my students this all the time, what techniques can we import, can we bring into our own writing that we admire in someone else's work? I'm a big, big believer in the model. Like having models that do the kind of thing that we want to do or that we have to do, like in your, oh, that sounds hard. But having like the models and writing towards the model, using the model as a guide, until we figure out what our voice is or how we navigate it. It's like we don't have to, I think this is true in all kinds of writing. We don't have to be expert or polished at the beginning. Which reminds me of one other thing, and then I want to see if there are any other thoughts or questions before I ask Christopher to come up. But for my students, I really do stress that the first draft does not have to be good. Like if they can just get their ideas down, we can go back and revise. We can go back and clarify. We can go back, but just like trying to get their ideas down in some shape without. And I imagine this would be very challenging for students writing in English. Again, English is, it's just that sometimes I think about the O-U-G-H, cough, though, enough, right? It's just like, it's so many different sounds and it's the same set of letters and you don't say, whatever. Anyway, that's a digression. But having the relief to not be good, like it's okay not to be good. Lots of people, their first drafts of most things are not good. And if I can that's one of the biggest gifts that I can give to my students is to let go of having to be polished in their first draft. If they're trying to be perfect in their first draft, it blocks ideas. It makes it hard for things to come out. Right? Because they're really focused on, well, have I said it correctly? It's like, just say it. You can go back and revise it to be correct. Let it be messy on the first go, you know? But I think that also requires on our part as instructors some scaffolding for the students.
I have another question. Thank you. Talking about what exactly that point, that leads me to another question. Imagination for you as a writer is within your personality, it's part of yourself, or how do you develop it? How do you learn it? Because writing a poem is so easy maybe to say, okay, maybe the first, it's gonna be not quite good. It's probably doesn't have any sense or whatever, doesn't make any sense, I'm sorry. But the thing is, how do you develop your imagination? Do you use different techniques or how do you do it?
My answer to this is that I focus with my students on description. So they don't have to use their imagination. If they can describe, like the way that you describe the people on the beach, right? So you describe the people on the beach in your paragraph, like when we were talking about your paragraph. There were the people in the colorful swimsuits, the people who were wearing the hats, the color of the sand, the color of the ocean, the color of the sky, which was lighter blue than the ocean. Trying to get my students to do that, they're like, no, I want to make similes and metaphors. And I'm like, no, you need to learn how to describe. Because you can do a lot with the description, even if you don't have the imagination to make the similes and the metaphors, right? Like the sand was like this, right? If you describe the sand and you connect that with a feeling, that can be enough to be interesting to someone else. So that's not imagination. Right? So that's like good nouns, good verbs. It's like building blocks, right?
I was remember that I tried to read, and I tried because I haven't finished the book yet, The Analyst. And one of the things that you are saying is absolutely true. The author describes so many things with so little detail that I most of the time with my translator, that makes it so exhausting, you know, because the third paragraph, I'm totally brain exhausted. Like, I've been searching a lot of adjectives, you know.
This is why poems are great. They're little. Not a novel, just a little piece of art. Do we have any questions from this side of the room, or for anyone from the sort of front part? Do y'all have any thoughts or anything you want to add before we go forward? Oh, yes. Here. Oh, let's get you a microphone. There.
You mentioned at the beginning that there were these three like pillars or three basics. You talked about line, images, and what was the third one? I forgot.
What was the third one? Oh, distance, point of view.
Point of view.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those are mine. And it can change from semester to semester, but that's those are sort of like three that I come back to across the years, because those are sort of, to me, interesting techniques. There's a lot of technique in sort of manipulating point of view. There's a lot of technique in thinking about the line. There's a lot of technique in thinking about images. And lots of poets do those things differently, like manage those things in different degrees. And so it's just helpful for me to keep in mind, like, these are some things that I want to think about, but your three things or two things can be whatever feels interesting or important to you. I think it's specific to us as instructors. So sometimes we have learning objectives that come from outside, right? Things that we have to do. I'm just thinking about the space and the aeronautic. That sounds science. That sounds hard. And then sometimes we can also bring in, like, what is an element of writing that feels really important for our students to take away, right? Like like alongside those external learning objectives, we can have one or two personal ones. And I think that also gives us more investment in the classroom as well, if we can think about, what do I want them to take away? Why am I in this space with them? Why am I teaching this class? Besides the money. Did you have a follow-up, or is that?
Yeah, thank you.
So Christopher, would you like to come up and talk a little bit about how do you say it, MOOC? Massive Online Open Courses, yeah. And then this Whitman Web, which is a pretty cool resource that you might share with your students, to share with their students, or just your students if you're teaching middle school.
Thank you, Donika. I love this class because I had the good luck for 10 summers to teach a kind of writers' conference for primary and secondary school teachers. And our thought was that we would treat the teachers who were coming to get continuing education credits. We would treat them like regular professional writers for the week, hoping that they would take that experience back into the classroom. And some of the ideas and the exercises we devised for them. But when we add to that, to students who are trying to learn another language, I think that the idea of playing around in the language hastens language acquisition. And I learned this, I taught, in America we have a thing called poetry in the schools, and I taught poetry in the schools for a few years, everyone from kindergarten up to 6th grade. And what I discovered very early on, especially with the kindergartners and first graders, was that when their creative imagination was involved, they start reaching for words they don't quite have yet, right? And then they find those words, and the excitement that can come about in those moments, I think, is great for any creative activity. But when you're trying to learn a language, or even just for a youngster trying to learn their own language, things go better. So what I wanted to talk about, what we do, if you could, Javier, go to the MOOCs, the very first one.
The third one.
Third one, the one that says MOOC, yeah. Okay, so we put together at the International Writing Program a total of 15 massive open online courses, MOOCs. You'll see one of these is in Spanish, and the courses are closed, but all of the videos that we made for the courses and the syllabi are all there with lots and lots of writing exercises. So feel free to use this resource in any way that you like. I think you'll find some interesting things. We taught courses in writing fiction, writing nonfiction, writing poetry, Yeah, and then if you could go down just a bit, I'll show you some other things. So nature writing, these are particularly writing poetry and plays, how writers write fiction, storied women. This is in Arabic, in Spanish. And then this is going to lead me to the next thing. We'll come back to that, but if you go down just a little bit more, these are writing for teenagers, flash fictions, how writers write fiction, how writers write poetry too. We had some of our greatest poets who actually gave, can you hold a second, gave lectures for us, including our former poet laureate, Robert Hass. So all of that is there, and then we'll stop right here at every atom. Now, if you'll go over to the next thing, section 1, right there, that's where we want to get. Okay. So maybe go up to the top of the page. So I direct the International Writing Program, and we've been around for 56 years now. We host distinguished poets, playwrights, fiction writers, essayists every fall for 3 months. We've had a lot of really great Mexican writers in our program, and they come to Iowa to spend 3 months or so writing, giving readings, doing panel discussions, and the like. The program is funded largely by the U.S. State Department from a grant through the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And about, 10, 12 years ago, they came to me with a really intriguing project, which was the U.S. has no diplomatic relations with Iran, as we know. So what they have, the State Department created a virtual embassy where Iranians could find out about the U.S. online. And they said to me, could I figure out a way to introduce some aspect of American literature to an Iranian audience? And what I did, we work at the University of Iowa, which has vast resources, including the greatest scholar of our age when it comes to Walt Whitman, a man named Ed Folsom. So I had this crazy idea. I said, what if we take the 52 sections of Song of Myself, the most famous early poem, the fountainhead of American poetry, and look at it week by week. I'll ask Ed to write a foreword to each section, and we'll keep going down. And then we'll have the poem in English right here. This is the first section. Then I wrote a kind of poetic, we can keep going down a bit, afterword to it. And then we posed a question, and we translated the whole thing into Farsi. Okay? And the way we did it was, I knew a really terrific Farsi Iranian-American poet, and along with another Iranian poet who was shuttling between Mexico, as it happens, and Iran, they started translating the poem into Farsi. Then we realized that we could do this in a lot of languages. We could do it in Spanish, so you'll see the next session. No, if you could just click on the next one. Yeah, here we have it in Spanish. So all 52 sections. And then if you could click back to the section we had just before, right there, yeah, and go down to the, right here. So we have it in Spanish, we have it in Farsi, we have 2 different versions of the poem in Arabic, Russian, German, Ukrainian, 15 languages altogether. And here, this is I think great for students who are trying to master English. We asked a professional actor, Eric Forsyth, who taught at the University of Iowa, to record the entire poem. So I'm going to ask Javier you'll hear the first short section of Song of Myself in Eric Forsyth's dramatic presentation.
Song of Myself. 1. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents born here, from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard, nature, without check, with original energy.
And as it happens, Ed and I also, we recorded our forewords and our afterwords. And so if you want a podcast or you want to give the students a way to hear how we would read what we wrote, that might be useful for the study of English. And Whitman is a pretty wild and wonderful poet. When we did this thing, the other thing that occurs to me when we think about how to learn another language and learn how to write, I often say to students, if you have another language, you can always translate from one language to the next. So you have students who their mother tongue is Spanish, but now they're learning English. To have them translate from Spanish into English or English into Spanish, that will hasten their language acquisition. And also, if they're interested in writing, it's a quick and not easy, but it's a way to learn how to write and how to serve your apprenticeship as a young writer. So,
Yeah, that's another way of getting inside, right?
Yeah.
Getting inside the language and the shape. And what I love about Whitman, this is just, I was thinking this, like, is he's so descriptive. So many descriptions, lists and lists of descriptions.
Yeah.
And so it's the sounds then become hopefully pleasurable, sometimes less so.
But
I like Whitman.
as you said that, I was thinking that you could go many sections into a list of occupations, and it's just like your idea of making a list of nouns for the students have to get into a poem, right?
Yes. Oh, we need
I think you need the mic for the audience.
and we can share.
Thank you. My first years of student English was in the States. And since I was always in adult programs, never came to my mind about writing about poetry. Poems is definitely something really new for me now. As you are saying, since they are kids at school, they learn, and this is a very good exercise for writing, how to write poems. Makes sense? Absolutely. Because here in Mexico, we start like, okay, let's write a story, and there is a topic, for example, simple present tense, and there is a topic, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now you have to write a paragraph 50 to 100 words. And it's like, of course the students are like, I don't feel connected, what I was saying a couple of minutes ago. I don't feel connected with this topic of the story. But never came to my mind that poetry was so important. It's like the beginning of the real writing thing. Am I correct?
It can be. And it's just a different way. Christopher, no, I think you should say we can share. Oh, you're going to go get something? Okay. I think that can absolutely be true because it's a different way of getting into or approaching an idea. So it's like they don't have to tell a story. They can try to describe a feeling, which is different. You go, Christopher. And that's like it's a shift in perspective. So I would think of it as like alongside, right? Like not instead of the stories and the paragraphs and those exercises, but maybe as all right, y'all have been really working out, you've been doing a great job. Let's do something fun, right?
And here's a way to do it. As you were talking, I suddenly thought of this poem. It's a great resource like the American Poetry Academy, but a poet named Sean Singer every morning sends out 5 poems that he curates. And today he sent out a poem I didn't know by Campbell McGrath, which is, I think, perfect for teaching people how to write. It's a, well, you'll hear. It's the alphabet, okay? The poem is titled Seashells, Manasota Key. That's on the Gulf of Mexico in Florida. And here's how it begins. Abras, augurs, arcs, and angel wings. Next stanza. Bubbles, bitumen, baby's ears, bleeding teeth. He's just taking the names of all the shells that you could find on the beach, right? Next stanza. Crenulate, nut clams, and pointed cingulas, dog winkles, diplodons, donax, dacina. You see what he's giving you an alphabet, right?
Oh, he wants you to get a little closer to the microphone.
So he's going through the alphabet. So I'm thinking, what you can do. I have a friend who always with his students he would say, you're going to write a short story of 26 sentences. The first sentence begins with A. The second sentence begins with B. Third sentence begins with C. Right? These kinds of things are fun ways to play. And here's one more exercise that I've always loved. The poet Richard Kenny gave this exercise to a class I was teaching, a poetry class. It was the most diabolical exercise. You had to write a poem of 10 words, and each word had to have one more letter than the previous word, right? So
terrible.
Insane. What an insane thing. But so I'm driving home that night, and I suddenly think, I am the mare, M-A-R-E, night, N-I-G-H-T, forgot. And, yeah, and then I kept going, and I had a little poem of 10 words about a horse. And then I thought, well, you do one horse, do another horse, right? I am the colt women something or other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's completely silly, except that sometimes the silliest exercises can lead to the most creative kinds of breakthroughs. I loved it. My students hated him, though.
Those exercises get us away. The reason poetry, I think, is so fun is that there are so many games that people play, right? You can say, it has to have this many syllables, this sentence, like 10 lines, each line has to have a certain number of syllables. What's in the line? Well, who cares what's in the line? Right? It's like trying to get folks to engage with the language without worrying necessarily about communicating narratively sense.
Yeah.
Although you can, right? That's available. But if they just want to play around with sounds, I love this. I was thinking, you could do this with so many different kinds of things.
Well, the other thing I read this morning that made me think of it, it's our old friend Robin Schiff, who has a new book out called The Information Desk. She worked at the information desk of the Museum of Modern Art. So then here's the exercise, the way she describes it. In Information Desk, I've tried to use my stanzas more obviously as timekeepers, and instead of arbitrarily counting the number of syllables in each line, I've created a syllabic stanzaic structure equal to my own age when I wrote it. As absurd a pursuit as this was, this seemed to me a way to strongly be in, of, and with time. However, the poem took many years to write, so the stanzaic form needed to keep growing in scale to accommodate the passage of years. I mean, it's a deeply silly idea, except it became a way for her to create form around all this information. And she's got a really lively verbal imagination, so you can see that she's trying to figure out a way to contain it and then spring it loose.
Yeah, poetry is so fun, especially if folks aren't worried about the product, right? The poem being good. It's like the process, the exercise, the play can give us so much. Like so much can come out of that experience. It's like I love an 11-lined poem with 10 to 11 syllables in each line. Like, I'm like, oh, this feels nice. Why? Why does it feel nice? I don't know. So,
I also think about there was a poet, an American poet named William Stafford, who famously wrote a poem every day of his life. And there was a story that he was teaching at a writers' conference, and a woman came up to him and said, what's the matter with this poem? And he looked at her and he said, just lower your standards, madam. and he said, anybody could write a poem every day if their standards were as low as mine. And then his son wrote a really beautiful memoir about him, in which he retold the story. And a woman said to him, well, where he gets that idea, when we talk about lowering the standard, that was from medieval jousting or medieval warfare, where you lowered the standard. And so what he was really doing was saying, I don't care if it's going to be any good or not. I'm just going to lower the standard. We'll see what happens. Right?
and with my students, I'm often telling them, they get stuck. They're like, I want this to be good. I want this to be good. And I'm like, just write another poem.
Yeah.
Stop. Just write another one. Write like the part that feels confusing. Sometimes like there will be a part in their drafts that feel confusing. And I'm like, take this part out and write a poem from that part.
Yeah.
Like just try, just go do something else. Like don't get stuck right here. So, and I think that is about, in some ways, moving away from the notion of perfection, where it's like your students might need to be polished in some other spaces, right? Like they might need their essays to be polished, they might need their exams to be polished, but having a space that's not that can really sort of let off some steam, right? It can release some of the stress of having to be like very, very good. I think that can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, just in the same way that we all learn a language not by being perfect, but by diving in and making all kinds of mistakes until suddenly we're not making those mistakes, right?
A question in the back?
Just as a recommendation, if someone needs, resources for writing a poem, for example, there is a book called C2 Proficiency. It's for Cambridge, and it's amazing because it has like 4 lessons for writing poems, and also the lessons teach you onomatopoeia in a very fun way, and honestly, students love it. In my case, I've never thought to teach how to write a poem, but that book helped me honestly a lot. So in case someone needs another resource, that book can be very, very helpful.
What's the title of the book again?
It's C2 because it's for students who wants to do the proficiency test for Cambridge. And the name of the book is C2 Proficiency. And you can buy both, is of course the student's book and the workbook. Yeah, and it's really, really helpful for teachers and also for the students. And you are going to find out more about how to write a poem, and also the activities. I mean, the methodology that Cambridge follows, it's very fun.
Yeah.
Huh?
Fantastic.
You will find a lot of activities there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that recommendation. I was thinking of another exercise that I like to do with my students where they take the first line from somebody else's poem. It's like you don't have to think of the first line. The first line is so hard.
Yeah.
And if it's somebody else's first line, it's like, oh,
then
great.
you're halfway there.
Yeah. You've entered into the space, you know. And I think just it's important to have some spaces that are fun in writing because, again, it is such a hard skill. And I think as someone who loves it but hated it in high school, I hated it in high school. I was like, this is dreadful. And everyone kept saying, you're good. And I was like, but it feels bad. You know, it's like there's something about that where it's one can even have like some proficiency and it not be pleasurable. But there can be, I think, different kinds of pleasure in writing the freedom to not make sense, I think, is a big one.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, you don't have to make any sense at all. You can just put some, what sounds interesting.
Make a pleasing sound.
Yeah.
That can be enough. The favorite part I had of teaching the experience of writing was one afternoon I would team teach with another poet. And what we wanted to say to the teachers was, we're going to look at some poems, and at some point during this class, we're going to devise an exercise. We don't know what it is at this point, but we want to give you the tools for figuring out how to do such a thing. And when Donika was talking about looking at a poem very closely, so you're looking at a poem very closely, and then you're talking about it with the two of you, and at some point you think, well, we could try something like this, or we could try something like that. You know, it's probably going to fail, but why not? You know.
Are there other questions or thoughts or ideas that folks want to offer? Wonderful, thank you.
What could you advise someone who has the first teaching moment when teaching creative writing? What could be the essential to teach?
An essential thing to think about or when first teaching creative writing?
Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, first you read, then you write. So read a poem closely with the students, try to figure out what some of the meanings might be. And every intervention the students offer is right. You just want to build on that. There's no right or wrong way to read a poem. And then maybe you say, let's try to write something like this, but in a different setting, different characters, different language, right?
I think that's so important, like that reading, and then like writing comes after that, and I think that's so important. A lot of young writers don't want to read. Like they don't want to read it. They're like, or they want to read things that have just come out, but they don't want to read deeply into the past. And giving them the opportunity, I think, to like come up with exercises based on the poem. Sometimes if we're reading work where the language, it's English, but it's very different English than we speak, I'll say, let's translate this. We're going to translate this from English in 1700s to how we speak now. Like, what is your translation of this poem? So even imagining that there's some work we can do at that level can just be so fun. And I think having a sense of play. Yeah, I think just coming in with curiosity is really, really important. And I don't like to come in with a lot of rules.
Yeah.
People love rules. They're like, don't use this. You can't write about that. I'm just like, we can do whatever we want. Because I think about Audre Lorde. She writes, in poetry is not a luxury. There are no new feelings, there are no new ideas, only new ways of making them felt.
Yeah.
So nothing's new.
Yeah.
We can do whatever we want.
Jory Graham once told me that she brought a poem into a workshop with the poet Mark Strand, and the poem was titled Nobility. And Mark Strand said, you can't write about nobility. And Jory said she went home, she cried for 3 hours, and then she wrote a poem called Nobility.
I had a colleague in graduate school who said, you can't use beauty in a poem, you can't use love in a poem. And I was like, maybe you can't. But these are things that I care about, so I will be doing that. But I just think like people just come up with notions, and giving folks the room to play, to try out things in a low stakes way, I think is really vital. It's one of my favorite things. Do you have a question? No? Are you sure? Okay. I think we have time probably for a few more questions, or, Christopher and I will talk, like we're obviously talkers, but but if, are there anything from this side? You know how you do that in class and then your students just look at you?
You're going to be your students? That's fine. That's fine.
Have you ever tried playing in this way, which sounds like so refreshing and so so good to hear from experts? But have you ever tried playing with language in two different languages, like writing or composing, and making them, like make sense? Or
I would say it's actually something happening much more frequently in American poetry these days because it's a country filled with so many different languages, and that notion of once upon a time you had to learn to speak the King's English, yeah, for some people that works, but and in certain business settings that will be useful. But I think some of our most interesting poets are moving between Spanish and English in really interesting ways, and that's part of how we understand the world. Yeah.
I haven't done that because English is the language that I have. But coming here, I was like, I want to get my Spanish up. The next time I come back, I'm going to be speaking in sentences. I'm very excited. But in the U.S., there are vernacular Englishes that have different grammatical rules and structures. And one of them is African American vernacular English, or I think of it as like Black American English. And I write in that a lot. That's how my family talks. Those sounds are so correct to me. It's like I love, it's like I'm happy to speak in standard American English. I can do it. I can write it. It has its own pleasures. But the language of my family, the vernacular of my family, is just one of my favorite set of sounds in the world. So I sometimes am, and I might read a poem tonight that takes that up a little bit.
Because it's a way of speaking, but it's also a set of rhythms that are integral to your whole being. So, yeah.
And there are people in the U.S. who say, well, that isn't proper English, or that's not real English, or you're grammatically incorrect. And I'm like, you don't like pleasure, and that's not my problem. I don't know. I just and I think that's a way of trying to say, like, that language is illegitimate.
Yeah.
Right? That language ought not to be taught or talked or spoken in certain spaces. Yeah. And I'm like, it's beautiful. Like, get into it. Have a good time.
The poet John Ashbery, in one of his books, wrote a lot of poems out in French and then translated them back into English. He was living in Paris at the time, working as an art critic. But the reason he wanted to write in French was because he thought that would shake up his way of thinking about what a sentence might be and what the sounds of poetry might be. And it was for him just another form of exploration. And that's what I think we're really trying to get at here. I think there's...
Thank you. I don't know, guys, if you notice that in Mexico or our Mexican culture, unfortunately, people don't read that much. And that's a big problem. When it comes to write, and you just say it, read before, then you write. But as a teacher, this is something that we deal with every day. So your recommendation, your suggestion, what would it be to introduce the students or to feel love or passion of writing in the sense of, yes, I'm discovering something new, because it's not our, I don't know why, it's not part of our culture, like, hey, mommy time, reading time, I got a bed, we got a book, It is not our way. And it's very, how do you say, it transcends through the time, okay? When you are a kid being taught by your parents, get a book, read at night, and then as an adult, it's a habit, all right, that you learned during the childhood. But we don't come along with those great ideas because it's not part of our customs. So what would it be your suggestion or your recommendation for us teachers, the other side?
So we were talking a little bit about reading in the car on the way over, and Americans don't read a whole lot. It's not as, you know, and I think it's in some ways it's better than it has been in certain areas. But what's wonderful, to answer your question, what's wonderful about poetry is the poems can be small. So the students don't have to love to read or have a history of reading if they can enter into a small piece of writing or a short piece of writing, where like a novel might feel ambitious, right? So if you bring in a poem or a very, very short story, and there are lots of those, like flash fiction around, bringing in that work, reading it together. So if we go back to that exercise that we sort of started with, where it's like the students read silently, and then someone in the class reads the poem aloud, and then we listen to the poet read the poem, like hearing it like 3 or 4 times, even if the students don't have practice as like strong readers. If you give them a task, what are the nouns? Right? Like, what jumps out at you? Where is this poem set? If you can give them a set of questions that are sort of leading them through the activity, leading them through the reading, I think that's really grounding. And I would say bring in work that you love. I think that's one of the most important things. Like, I bring in books that I'm excited about. I share poems with my students that I'm excited about, because they don't have to be excited. I will be excited. I will be like, oh my, can you believe? Sometimes I used to like throw my book. I would be like, get out of here. This is outrageous. How dare you write work this beautiful? You know, my students would be like, why are you acting like this? I was like, perhaps you are not moved by beauty. That's not my business. But I will be. And I tell them explicitly, right? I say explicitly, you do not have to be excited about this work, but I am asking you to engage with it. You don't have to love it. I will do that work. Right? And then that way it's like somebody's excited in the room, right? But sometimes we have to teach things that we aren't excited about. And it can be helpful to try to find a way into excitement or interest, which I think can just be like an interesting task.
I love that. I actually took a class at Berkeley called Poetry in the Schools, and I studied with this really wonderful Mexican-American poet and novelist named Floyd Salas, and he said one day, teaching is easy. You just fall in love with your subject and you communicate your love. And that's what he really did. And I remember one day, so we were young writers and young poets, and we were trying to invent exercises. And I remember a guy had he brought in a kind of an African mask, and he had a ruler. And I don't know what the exercise was going to be, but somehow or other the mask fell off, and he froze in front of all the students. And Floyd Salas, from the back of the room, he's wearing his leather jacket and his dark glasses. It turned out, I found out later, he was stoned for every class. But you know, he goes marching up to the front of the room. He said, "You screwed that up. You screwed that up." And we're like, "What?" And so he picks the mask back up, and he's holding the ruler, and he, you know, somehow or other manages to knock it over. And he takes the ruler and he says, "Take that," and he smacks the mask. And I realized that what he was doing was to say, when we're writing, we make mistakes, things fall apart, and just take advantage of it. So he was teaching us how to improvise on the way. So I remember, I'm just thinking now, for one very small writing exercise, I took a poem by Mark Strand, and it goes like this. I have a key, so I open the door. It is dark, and I walk in. It is darker, and I walk in. That's the whole poem. So then I was teaching a 6th grade class, and I read them that poem, and I said, okay, describe where you get once you walk in. It is darker, and I walk in. Just describe that for me. Oh my God, you can't imagine the things that came out of that little exercise. Or you could take a haiku of one. I'm always thinking of this one. New Year's morning, everything's in blossom. I feel about average. So you have the first line, New Year's morning. That's a date. It carries all sorts of meaning for us. It's in Japan, New Year's morning. Everything's in blossom, so we know the season. We can see the things. And then, how do you feel? I feel about average, right? So give your students, you got to get a date. You have to say what it looks like, and then tell us how you feel. That's easy, right? 575. 575, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
Here's another one I think about. Spiders in the corner, don't worry, I keep house casually.
Well, something I have learned so far is that, well, I'm not into poetry that much. I focus more on academic writings. And something I love the most is that creative writing or writing poetry is an space that provokes students to express and be themselves, right? So I think that's the most important, to have a space, a certain time in our classes that allows the students to be themselves, to express, to connect with the language, and to use it and go further. Is it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I will say that in my experience as a poet who has a PhD in literature, where I wrote a dissertation, and it was 200 pages, and I don't know why. I still don't know why. So like I want things to be short, and they were like, no, it needs to be. I was like, why? But I do think that the poetic sensibility and that sense of play made my academic writing much livelier, much more interesting. And because I took such pleasure and I take such pleasure in poetry, I want to also take pleasure in the academic writing. And sometimes, like, so in analyzing literature, one can make little flourishes in lots of ways. But having like a syntax that's a little bit surprising, describing something in a way that's a little bit surprising. Like I've sort of carrying those modes across sort of a divide that really is, you know, it's all writing, you know? And if there are some ways to sort of stay anchored in the description as something that's important. Like I used to do copy editing for a math professor. I never knew what he was talking about, the plank, this, and the, I don't know, there were a lot of constants, and I don't know, it was like cosmology and physics, and I don't know what any of this is. But I could get the rhythm, like we worked together for about 2 years, so I like came to understand the rhythm of his sentences, which then made it easier to offer comments. And English was his second language. I think his first language was Portuguese. He's Brazilian. And so and I think the rhythm of his language, the rhythm of his sentences in English, I don't know like how they compare to other math professors. Like math is an international discipline. But there was like a kind of like learning, like the energy. Even if I didn't know what he was saying, like I never understood anything. But I was like, where is the verb? Where is the noun? How are these clauses fitting together? That was my approach to that. But there still was like sort of pleasure in just like being in that space too.
Yeah. And it seems to me one of the things you're trying to do is to give the students a sense of the pleasures of reading poetry, reading literature. And you do that by communicating your love for it with the hope that there will come moments in every student's life where they will need something to read because their life has fallen apart. All the losses that we accumulate, we find in literature ways to make sense of all those things. And I think that's kind of what we're here to try to do, right?
I think last question.
Yeah, I'm very, very curious about when writing a poem. Is it free? I mean, you can use it freely. Slang, such as gonna, watcha, ain't. You can do that. Oh, fantastic.
You can do anything you want.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Great.
Because who's going to tell you can't? I mean, like there are people, again, the people with the rules.
Yeah.
But we can do anything we want. Yeah. So you can use slang. You can mix it up. Like I love that suggestion of mixing language a little bit. You can translate. You can write it in one language, translate it to another language, translate it back, right? Try to like see what changes. Like I think it's a space of play. Yeah.
Now, think about a staple of American high schools curriculum is to read the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, right? And if you like it, you love it forever, right? But take the Mark Twain's preface to it. He talks about how he was able to write in what he loved most about that book was writing in the various dialects of southwestern or southeastern Missouri, southeastern Missouri. He had at least 6 different dialects, and I keep, as you were just talking now, I thought, there's an exercise. You just read the preface, which is probably for most students boring, but then you say, look at this thing. So how about you, can you write a sentence in 3 different dialects? 3 different registers that you hear. Maybe the way your grandmother would say it, or your crazy Uncle Freddie would say it, right? Or your little sister would say it.
Or how you would text it.
How you would text it, yeah.
Right? Like how would you text it?
Yeah. And spell it then, right?
Yeah. How would you say this sentence to someone you respect? Yeah. Right? Like someone like in a professional way?
Yeah.
How would you say it to your friends? Yeah. Like just sort of like trying to get that tone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those different tones, right? And then how to manage them in one piece of writing. Mm-hmm. He wrote a novel that, as Ernest Hemingway said, that was the start of the American novel, right? So.
Thank you all so much. This was so wonderful. This is a great conversation. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Donika.
For coming up. And I'll turn it over to Claudia.
Well, thank you. I know you want more of this, so you are invited to come back at 5, because we are going to continue, continue with this conversation. Donika will be reading her work. Christopher will be also with us. So thank you for participating in this activity, and I hope to see you this afternoon and later hearing other activities from the library. Thank you, Donika. Thank you, Christopher. This was really nice. Thank you. Yes. Thank you.